Yeah, all right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to see a good crowd today. My name is Laura Bogar. I'm in plant biology upstairs, but I do ecology of sort of plant fungal symbioses. And today it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. David Dralle, who's a research hydrologist with the U.S. Forest Service. I met David happenstantially, more or less, through some oak connections last year when I first was getting started here, and he's doing some very cool work looking at hydrology on some of the oak savanna landscapes and other types of landscapes, thinking about how water moves through deep soil layers and into plants. The plants part is the part that I'm especially excited about, but I think David has broad interest in hydrology generally. So originally, David trained as an electrical engineer. He got his bachelor's degree at the University of Illinois Champaign, then a master's in applied math at Columbia University, then a PhD in environmental engineering at UC Berkeley, and a postdoc at the Eel River Critical Zone Observatory. So as he did all of that work, he started really quantitative engineering, and we have dragged him into an ecological direction, I think, over the last few years. He taught at Sacramento State before beginning his work with the Forest Service in 2020. Reading David's work and citing the papers where he's really looked at sort of, especially these oak savanna hydrology interactions, has shaped a lot of the way I think about tree microbe interactions. And I hope that for all of you, it ties into some of the interesting ecology that you like to think about in the landscapes around California. I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. So go for it, Dr. Dralle.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, this is really exciting to be here. I have always admired biology and eco folks on the Davis campus from afar, and have gotten to spend more time here lately. I don't know how population biology this will be exactly, but I will say at the outset, I'll say it again at the end, we are definitely thinking more and more, at least in my lab group, about kind of the interactions between the kind of deep water cycling in the subsurface in the plant root zone, and how that sort of plays a role in mediating kind of microbial populations of the subsurface, and carbon balance and kind of nutrient and carbon exchange in the root zone. So it's kind of like an area of interest, I think, that I'm trying to understand and learn more about. So I might talk a little bit more about that, but that could be something that hopefully folks who are thinking about those things will keep that in mind, and feel free to ask any questions along those lines. And I'll also just throw out that a lot of this work, especially some of the runoff, there's a whole other flip side of the kind of my program of research, which is really focused on runoff and flow regimes. And I'd say that actually is more ecological in terms of my, or more like population biology focused in terms of my own emphasis. And we do a lot of work with salmonid researchers and thinking about how flow regime and the subsurface impact kind of salmonid life history diversity, where and when salmon can access different parts of watersheds, foodscapes and watersheds. And to me, that's a really exciting area of interest. So again, I won't really dig into any of that, but at the very end, there'll be some links to papers, and I'm happy to expound or talk more about any of the runoff implications or flow regime related kind of questions too. So if that comes up in questions, feel free to. But yeah, I will focus pretty much kind of, this is a very eco-hydrologically styled talk. So trees are an important element, primarily in terms of woody vegetation, but I really will be focusing more on the water balance aspects. In particular, understanding how water storage dynamics in the root zone impacts both tree water availability and tree response to drought, but also thinking about how that affects the overall water balance of forests, and in general, how that kind of ties in with drought and increasing drought frequency and severity, and how thinking about the root zone, especially the deep root zone, which we'll get into, is essential for understanding the drought response of California landscapes. And yeah, just all these great people that I work with. This will be a very broad talk, so different people will come in at different times for different kind of components, but everyone's all doing awesome stuff. I contact any of them if you want to ask specific questions, especially about some of the papers. So mountains and watersheds around the world are changing. Some places drier, some places wetter, hotter, changes in kind of the fraction of precipitation that arrives as snow versus rain, et cetera. One big, very clear signal that emerges from global climate models and climate simulations in California is that there's this expected increase in the kind of volatility or the variability of precipitation patterns from year to year. And so this is a 2018 pretty highly cited paper by Nathan Swain and some co-authors looking at kind of the alteration or the alternation between extremely wet and extremely dry years in California. So this is a plot of the percent change in extremely wet seasons in Northern California going through 2080 under a particular climate scenario. And the take home is generally this kind of warmer, more volatile West. And that's especially true in California. And it's, you don't have to look particularly far back in our precipitation or climate records to find good examples of what variability or volatility in precipitation means. So of course, there was the historic drought from 2012 to 2016 that at the time I made this slide, it was over 130 million trees in the Sierra documented mortality cases. Trees died in the Sierra Nevada alone. I think that's closer to like 150 million now that we've done all the counting. But Forest Service actually flies planes and that has statistical kind of, actually, probably a lot of you are familiar with the methods, but like kind of doing counts with their eyes, and then they have some methods for scaling that up and extrapolating to like an actual number of trees, so tree deaths per acre. On the flip side, immediately emerging from this period of drought, we had the single wettest year, at least statewide, on record in California. At some of my Northern California sites in Mendocino, we got over 3.5 meters of rain. So it's a pretty epic rainfall year. And really, I guess from an infrastructure standpoint, this really mattered. This is a picture of the Oroville spillway after near catastrophic failure. So the spillway overtopped, and there's a lot of this like unbelievable head cut. For those of you that are like subsurface nerds, there's a lot of cool rock and kind of soil pictures here. But one theme that I'd say has emerged kind of in post hoc analyses of all these drought and deluge type kind of events in California is that our ability to predict things like, for example, forest mortality, our ability to predict what stream flow runoff, snowmelt runoff will look like emerging from periods of drought is challenged when we're training or calibrating or whatever our models or statistical approaches off of historical data. And so this is if you're interested in sort of the state of tree mortality prediction and some of the things that we're missing, mortality prediction using physiological and climatic data alone doesn't work so well. And this is, I don't know, does anybody remember this collection of news articles that came out in 2021? This really caught my attention. There was a almost 100% over prediction, double, right, of how much snowmelt runoff was going to make it into the reservoirs during the 2021 melt period. DWR's like historical runoff model over predicted runoff by about 100 by double. So it's based off of snowpack and historical precip records and that fall apart. So the question in both of these cases and a bunch of other cases, I guess, is what's missing and what's incomplete in our current observations that is challenging prediction. And the answer to that question is pretty complicated. In the case of mortality, for example, there's proximate causes of tree mortality like bark beetle. There's a lot of interesting research happening there, and plenty of unanswered questions, as a lot of my colleagues in Forest Service will tell you if you ask them. But one area, I guess, of research that's particularly interesting to me, and I would say is a really fundamental but incompletely documented variable in terms of understanding the drought responsive landscapes is subsurface water storage. So here I've I've illustrated what I'll refer to as kind of a unit hill slope, a kind of archetypal picture of what a hill slope in an upland landscape looks like, both above ground and importantly for what we're talking about below ground. And whether or not, eco-hydrological drought kind of emerges following climatic drought is really a subsurface question, right? Trees, for example, don't necessarily care how much it rains per se, they care how much water is stored in their root zone, right? And so to really survey a landscape and ask kind of what is the state of a watershed in terms of, asking about tree drought stress or asking about runoff generation via groundwater, we need to be able to look below ground. And in our seasonally dry California watersheds, to answer that question fully, you have to really go deep to constrain the entirety of kind of what's going on in terms of both the root zone and in terms of groundwater. So this picture incorporates, I guess, 3 different kind of primary layers in the subsurface. So I'll refer to soil. It's a near surface geomorphically moving layer. This is the distinction that geomorphologists make between soil and not soil. Soil is kind of like left the mothership. It's bioturbated. It's actually physically advecting and diffusing down slope. Over geological timescales, it's getting carried away and is contributing to erosion of the landscape over longer times. Below soil, there's often, especially in a lot of our kind of upland forested watersheds, tens of meters of weathered, fractured bedrock. So some folks will refer to this as like saprolite, which is highly weathered bedrock rock material. So physical and chemical weathering changes the kind of porosity and chemical structure of the rock, opens up fractures and fissures. It opens up new pores, water can make its way in. Chemically active water from the atmosphere that's slightly acidic can make its way in, weathering processes kind of open up. And importantly, it's this deeper weathered bedrock layer that often can store significant amounts of seasonally cycling water that supplies water to trees, and also water that drains vertically to groundwater tables that, at least in our subsurface explorations, almost always sit kind of perched atop a deeper, fresh, unweathered bedrock layer, generally at the ridge of a lot of forested landscapes. This is on the order of tens of meters below the ground surface. And it's this deeper groundwater that resides in the fractures and fissures of weathered fractured bedrock in a saturated zone, essentially, that laterally moves and feeds streams. And so if I was gonna just leave you with one thing today, it would just be this picture of what the subsurface looks like in upland mountainous environments. Deep bedrock weathering, groundwater tables in fractured rock aquifers, trees that access water from a thin soil layer, typically about 1 meter thick, and a deeper weathered fractured bedrock layer, and then a stream that, at least during the long summer dry season, obtains or gets most of its water from lateral groundwater transport along this fresh bedrock boundary. And I was sitting here, really, I just used the word saturated zone. Should I define saturated versus unsaturated for the population biology? Okay, cool. So maybe for me, the easiest way to differentiate saturated versus unsaturated is if I have a porous media like sand or rock or anything that has both solid and gas and liquid inside of it. Saturated material is, imagine if I were to just reach down magically and pull a handful of this material out from under the hill slope. Saturated material is fully filled with water. There's no gas. All the void spaces are completely filled with liquid water. And importantly, if I were to hold it up, the water would freely drain out the bottom of that piece of material. So there's kind of a hydraulic consequence related to saturation. And it's that water tends to move more readily under gravity downwards. And if there's a slope, right, downwards force translates into lateral movement. So that's saturated. Unsaturated is everything above. Like if I were to drill a hole, you would actually find that there's a free water surface kind of right around this particular depth. Everything above that, there's water stored, but it's held under tension, just like water in a sponge or something like that. There's small spaces in the rock and the sand and all those materials that hold little capillary menisci of water in the same way that, you know, if you get your finger pricked and you put the little glass tube and it sucks the blood up. There's a tension force associated with these small pores that can hold on to water. And so again, there's water here, but if I were to hold that material up, it would not necessarily be sort of like actively freely draining below that particular chunk of material. Importantly, water that's stored in the unsaturated zone is still accessible to plants. Plants can exert tension that's greater than the capillary forces in the soil and the rock that's holding on to that water. So plants can remove that water by creating an even greater pull force, an even greater suction force, and then pulling that water through the roots and out through their leaves and stomata. Yeah, are there any questions on the picture? We can stop and talk about it. Cool. Okay, so these are the things that I am going to go through today. One is where in the subsurface is the storage that matters for trees? How does this sort of tree or root zone water storage, how does it matter for understanding tree response to drought? And then finally, how does this plant available water storage in the subsurface, why does it matter for stream response to drought too? I'll go through all those pieces. And probably the most important subsurface parameter for understanding how trees experience drought and just in general, more broadly for understanding water balance in forests is this plant available water storage capacity. And you can really think of this as kind of like, how big is this subsurface sponge? What is the maximum volume of water that can be held in both soil and the weathered fractured bedrock that's available for extraction by plants? So you can almost think of it as like the difference between the maximum water that can be stored minus some minimum residual water storage that plants can no longer pull, right? Even like a really, really, really dry soil has a little bit of water in it still. Plants may not be able to access it, but it's still there. And so this root zone water storage capacity is a really, really important parameter. And I have a kind of an analogy that I like to use to explain roughly why I think it's so important. And this will seem like an oversimplification, and it is a simplification, but it's really not far off of the truth in terms of the actual dynamics that we measure in watersheds. And so there's a couple of principles. One, everyone's familiar with a sponge. You can take a dry sponge, hold it under the sink, it absorbs water up to a point. After that point, any additional water added to the sponge will result in dripping from the sponge, right? And so the wet sponge drips excess water. Once it stops dripping, once you've turned off the supply, right, it will stop kind of dripping from below, but it will hang on to that residual storage. And this drip and that filling process is really not far off from how groundwater recharge works in our upland mountain watersheds. And again, remember, it's the groundwater flow, going back to this picture, that drives stream flow, especially the kind of base flows during the summertime in our western forested watersheds. And so step one, the sponge and however much water I have to accumulate before it starts dripping dictates when recharge happens. Recharge is the process by which groundwater is refilled and groundwater produces flow. There's this direct linkage between sponge and stream flow in that sense. And then on the other end, the only way to fully dry that, there's no mechanism squishing the sponge below ground, right? So the only way that the sponge is actually fully dried is via evaporation and transpiration. So there's an actual sponge at my house that Gopal might recognize, where I took a picture of the sponge in the sun to just suggest that the only way for this sponge to fully dry out and get back to that original super dry sponge state is by water removal from these two processes. And so all this to say that the storage capacity of the sponge, like how big it is, right? Which is sort of what I asked you to think about in this slide, the storage capacity of the sponge. It determines two things. One, it tells you if you have a dry sponge, how much water do I have to add to the subsurface before I start to get this dripping, before I start to get effectively like significant runoff generation. And then two, the amount of water that I had to add to the sponge to get it to drip is the residual storage that kind of hangs out. It's left behind and is available for evapotranspiration. So the size of the sponge really determines these two, what I would say are like the kind of really primary, like important kind of physical processes in ecohydrology, which is one, runoff generation and when it happens and how much rain I have to add to make it happen. And two, how much water can be stored in terms of like maximum for plants below ground in the root zone. And again, like I'm being kind of like, it's a very simple analogy, but it's not that far from the truth. And if you're a little concerned so far about like the scale, like I'm showing you like a single hill slope, I'm showing you like a little profile, I'm not talking about big watersheds. I want to, I guess I just want to communicate kind of I don't even know what the right word is for this, like a philosophical perspective that I have about understanding landscapes. And it's that if I can understand a hill slope well, and I define a hill slope as this kind of, unit of a landscape from a ridge to a channel bounded by a stream on one side and bounded by a topographic divide on the other side. If I understand this, then I arguably understand kind of what a small watershed is all about. Because a small watershed is really just a collection of hill slopes. And so if I know what's happening inside of the hill slope and I make some assumptions about, that hill slope sure looks the same as that one, so they're probably doing something similar, then I understand small watersheds. And watersheds are these nested things. So if I get what's happening in my small watershed, then I understand what's happening in my big watershed. And so this understanding, right, continues to like transfer scales, hopefully, where we're looking at hill slope processes and constraining hill slope hydrological behavior. But the overall, like the overarching goal is to really try to get a better understanding of the landscape as a whole, all the way up to understanding like stream flows and reservoir management. And this is kind of, I don't know, this is almost like a hypothesis in a way, right? That there's like an atomic unit of the landscape I'm proposing is the hill slope. If I understand that, I can explain a lot of different things, even across these big scales. One major challenge though is like, how do we observe this root zone sponge in reality? It's actually extremely complicated. Like for my example that I just plotted, like I could just take the sponge and set it on a thing and take a picture of it. We can't really take pictures of the root zone sponge because it's often tens of meters deep, buried inside of rock. And so we use a lot of different methods from geophysics, from the petroleum industry actually, to query and measure and observe the subsurface in all sorts of different senses. I like to put the cabbage on here because I actually finished a talk once and like the whole group asked me what the cabbage meant. Like no one got it. You get the cabbage? It's like slicing into the hill slope, like looking at the layers. Okay. The cabbage is the hill slope. If you don't get it, it's why, because like apparently it's not. But now after that, I've realized I have to explain the cabbage. I haven't even been talking this particular slide in a while. So but we use a lot of different methods. Like I said, geophysics methods. We commonly drill. So like taking measurements in soils is usually pretty straightforward, but if you want to go deeper than soils, which you must, in California, I would say, then the equipment required is usually a little heavier and it's just generally more difficult. A lot of the methods that you would use to measure water content, for example, in soil are not applicable in weathered bedrock. So that's where a lot of the geophysics comes in and petroleum industry technologies. And then, Yeah, and then, like I said, we're exploring new methods too. So there's a cool agricultural tool called a VMS, and it's an incline borehole because water moving through the vadose, through the unsaturated zone, moves vertically. It's not laterally moving like groundwater. The fluxes are vertical. So if water is moving vertically, and you have a vertical borehole, how do you sample that water? It's hard. And so there's some cool stuff we're trying with like directional drilling and boreholes at different angles to intercept water with different ports as it's moving vertically through the vadose. So all this to say, it's kind of expensive. And so the question is like, how can we estimate some of these key water storage properties at the scale of national forests? Actually, I'm just going to skip these. I was going to do these slides to just be able to continue to belabor how hard it is to measure things. So I'll stop there. So one way we've addressed this observational challenge is to use rapidly advancing, remotely sensed precipitation and evapotranspiration data sets to track what I'll refer to as a root zone water storage deficit. And the deficit is really just a flip on the notion of storage, as opposed to thinking about how much water is there. I want you to think about how much water is not there. In other words, if I were to think about the storage capacity and the sponge filled up to the brim, and instead of tracking how much is there, I track how much I've removed starting from that sort. That's what the deficit is. You can think about it as like a credit card balance if you want. Like there's a lot of different analogies, but really it's just how dry is the sponge. And to illustrate this, I'm going to kind of go through a really basic deficit calculation. On the top, I have what's being removed from the sponge at any given time, evapotranspiration. Here I have what's being added to the sponge, precipitation. And then in this bottom axis, I'm going to track a deficit. So again, right, if inputs exceed outputs, then the sponge, you don't have to net remove any water from the sponge, right, to explain how much went in versus how much went out. So there's no accrual of deficit when that's the case. When outputs exceed inputs, that means that, well, if I use 4, I can only replenish 2 of the 4 that I used. And so I must have taken at least 2 units of water in this case from the sponge, from storage. And so I accrue a bit of a deficit. And I can march this forward through time, and the goal at the end is a couple of things. At any given time with this deficit metric, which again is entirely based off of like remote sensing data, I can at least put bounds on and start to answer 2 questions. One is, how dry is the sponge at any given time? Like how big is the deficit? It was really dry here because I didn't have much rain and I had a lot of ET for a couple of days, right? So the sponge is very dry. And then arguably I could also kind of put a bound on how big the sponge is, because going back to the credit card account kind of analogy, if you look at a balance through time, the maximum observed balance on a credit card account is some lower bound on how big the credit limit is, right? Like you can't borrow more than your credit limit. So man, maybe you can, but then you get in trouble next to it. But the analogy here is you can't withdraw more water than the capacity. And so the largest observed deficit over some period of time is a lower bound on the total size of the sponge on that root zone water storage capacity. So the question then is, what can we do with methods like this, and are they useful relative to some of our in situ observational approaches like that I kind of argued are a lot of work. Until recently, most scientists thought of plant rooting in bedrock and water use from bedrock as kind of more like an ecological oddity. There was a lot of work kind of talking about how bedrock water use is more like a water reservoir, water use story of last resort, only reserved for plants in drought when they're super desperate. And while it may be true that plants rely on bedrock water storage in drought, Erica, who I had at the beginning, Erica McCormick, who's now a grad student, she used this deficit approach to prove that bedrock water storage is an essential and regularly accessed component of this root zone sponge, and that we really need to dig deeper than soils into the weathered bedrock all over the place to better understand plant water sourcing, especially in the Mountain West. And so Erica's approach was pretty simple. It was very algebraic. It was, imagine I have an estimate of the root zone water storage capacity via that deficit method. And then I make this very straightforward assumption that came from that original picture, which is that the storage capacity of the whole root zone is just the sum of the soil and the rock. We actually have decent maps of soil water storage capacity, like the USDA NRCS, like Surgo, maybe you've heard of that soils data set. There are existing raster soils data sets that have this storage capacity embedded within them. And so we took all these places that we did a lot of filtering here. So there's a lot of space that you don't see, like this is not particularly applicable in these like really deep alluvial soils that you might find in the Midwest. But in a lot of our upland kind of rocky forested landscapes that we really care about from like a forest management standpoint, we could really say a few things. And Erica basically said, let's take the soil estimates that we have in those places, subtract it from the total root zone water storage capacity, and that's an estimate of the bedrock water storage capacity. So like super simple, but the results were very powerful and convincing to me, both because it was a very careful analysis and also because of this argument that this deficit method is really kind of putting a lower bound, right, on how much water is being used. It's actually a really conservative method. And the first major finding is that to explain plant water use, we started in 2004 and went through 2017 based off of the ET data set that we had. You really have to invoke this bedrock plant water use in almost all of the Mountain West to explain patterns of ET. In California, we calculated that every single year, bedrock water was withdrawn. Like you had to use water from bedrock to explain plant water use in all these green areas. In most years, you had to use it to explain everything in the purple. The black places we couldn't say for sure. Doesn't mean plants aren't using bedrock water there, but the mass balance method couldn't sort of force you to use it from a mass balance standpoint. A really cool thing about California that's not pictured here is that these places in green, generally they use bedrock water storage every year, but even beyond that, plant water storage in bedrock is usually greater than half of the total root zone water storage capacity in all of our kind of Sierra, coastal Mendocino, California, and especially down here in these southern California, like Chaparral, and there's some forest down here at the higher elevations too. And so if you want to explain, you know, like model, like a dynamic global vegetation model or something, predict plant biome or plant functional type or something as a function of climate, that you really need to, especially in California and seasonally dry Mediterranean type places, incorporate this deeper storage to explain the plant water use story. And Erica did some kind of fun, like back of the envelope type stuff. If you add up all the bedrock water storage estimates in California, the volume of bedrock water was actually roughly equal to like the volume of water in all the reservoirs across the state. So it's a lot of water. Knowing the size of the sponge, which is sort of what we just went through right there, is cool, but you know, it can tell us, or at least it can help us constrain where plants are getting their water, but it can tell us more than just where the water is coming from. In 2019, Jesse and I published a study looking at how does the sponge size relative to precipitation impact the sensitivity of plants to swings in precipitation from year to year. So this is finally like getting into the variability, volatility, drought question a little bit. And there are some actually kind of counterintuitive findings that came out of this that we thought were really cool. And again, I'm presenting the results in terms of pictures and sponges, but there is an actual very simple, like basic hydrological model in this paper. There's a paper that Dana published in 2022 that elaborates on this and takes into account snow and some other things. So if you like want to dig into those details, I would encourage you to go read this or email me. But this is like the kind of intuitive conceptual finding. And the finding is the main one is the following. Imagine that, again, my root zone storage capacity is my sponge. And I compare the size of that sponge to average precipitation from year to year. I can kind of break up my landscapes into one of two different categories. One I'm going to refer to as a storage capacity limited site. The other I'll refer to as a precipitation limited site. And this refers to what is the variable that's limiting how much water is stored below ground for plants. In the storage capacity limited site, what's happening is if I have a small storage capacity relative to my average precip, right? If the storage capacity divided by precip is small, i.e. less than 1, what that means is that this pitcher is generally bigger than the sponge, right? So in both wet years and dry years, relatively speaking, the sponge will fully wet to capacity. So, you know, this is again one of those kind of like this, I said this at the beginning, but plants don't care how much it rains, right? They care how much is stored in their root zone. So if the root zone storage capacity is small, I fill it up to capacity in deluge years and drought years, regardless. So there's a prediction, a kind of counterintuitive prediction that emerges from this, and it's that small root zone water storage capacity may impart a kind of hydrological resilience to forests in that in both wet years and dry years, they fill to capacity. So the plants in a sense don't know that it was a wet year versus a dry year. And so we'll test that hypothesis in a minute. The other case is the precipitation limited watershed, which I have like a big sponge, right? And so in really, really wet years fills up. In really, really dry years though, because the sponge is big, right? Maybe I only fill halfway up. So there's a lot of questions we could get into here, especially like kind of chicken and egg. Well, like if the forest is really big, like is it big because the sponge is big, or is the sponge big because the forest is big, or vice versa? We can talk about that. But there's some kind of, at least at a very basic level, we think this is a kind of useful way to think about the resilience or vulnerability of different forests to drought. And we also think it can explain some previously unexplained patterns in the biogeography of drought mortality. So here's a picture, this Garrett Young study from 2017, this like post hoc analysis of drought mortality, where they used a drought model, had soil, had a couple other things to predict mortality, and then they compared that to actual mortality. And some of the biggest misses that the model had, here's one that we really highlighted, was coastal Mendocino, California, where they predicted really significant mortality in a lot of these coastal watersheds. But in actuality, we saw almost no mortality in the coast, despite receiving like less than half of mean annual rainfall in a lot of those watersheds. I've mentioned this at the beginning, we have a lot of sites across the state where we're actually doing kind of intensive monitoring. And at two of those sites, this Oak Savannah site, and this is a broadleaf evergreen conifer, it's a madrone and Douglas fir primarily. We have water potential measurements at a collection of different plants across the hill slope. These are all lumped together in both this record drought year and this record wet year, right? So this is as dry as it ever got. This is as wet as it ever got. This is the pre-dawn water potential in those plants at the very end of the dry season of that record wet and that record dry year. And you can see in both these sites, right, the pre-dawn water potentials, this measure of drought stress is actually pretty much indistinguishable in both of those years. So the kind of take-home message of this plot is the plants didn't know that it was a record drought year versus a record wet year. Right? As far as they were concerned from a water availability standpoint, these years are kind of the same in a sense. And so the question is like, is this kind of, you're wondering, is this storage capacity limitation mechanism that we were, that I just discussed? And Daniela did her PhD at one of these sites and gave us this nice test where she was measuring water storage here in the bedrock root zone versus cumulative annual precipitation plotted on the x-axis. And what you end up seeing in these plots is that in all these different wells where we're measuring water storage over this whole root zone profile, as you accumulate rainfall, you similarly accumulate storage in the root zone, but only up to a point. After that point, you can no longer store water below ground in this unsaturated root zone layer. And so this is a picture of this sponge reaching the drippy sponge kind of capacity. This is a picture of the small sponge kind of exceeding storage capacity. Any additional water actually just drains vertically to groundwater. And so this provides like a really basic kind of mass balance test where we can look at precipitation and storage in the whole watershed. So this is like a whole catchment scale mass balance using stream flow, and say, does storage correlate with precip? If it doesn't, maybe it's like a small sponge storage capacity limited watershed. If it does, maybe it's a precipitation limited watershed, big sponge. And then we hypothesize that places like this, where storage is insensitive to precip, similarly, we would predict that vegetation would be insensitive to precip because of this storage capacity limitation mechanism. And the cool finding is that we went kind of across the state and found this whole spectrum of behaviors, from totally storage capacity limited sites to precipitation limited sites where if you rain more, you store more. If you store more, the plants feel it or they don't, right? And so to us, that was pretty exciting and like a good connection between this hill slope story that Daniela was telling with direct measurements and this whole catchment scale kind of mass balance story, identifying these sites via this mass balance based method. Kind of going forward, and this is the site that Laura was mentioning at the beginning, we had a lot of observations in storage capacity limited places, but we had not actually gone and drilled and monitored and done a lot of this work in precipitation limited places. So we identified in 2018 one of these places, this Oak Savannah site in the Coast Range, about an hour north of here. It's a pretty amazing site. There's really strong aspect controls and vegetation. It's exciting from a geological standpoint. We drilled and did a lot of characterization. And some basic kind of like mass balance type estimates had us suspecting that this was kind of like a shoulder site, somewhere between a storage capacity and a precip limited place. And basically after our first installation year, which is 2019, we had the perfect experiment to test that. And so in 2019, we had a fairly wet year and we had flow. 2020 was a pretty dry year. We had no discharge. 2021 was ridiculously dry, no discharge. And this was what we estimated that storage capacity was based off of some of our remotely sensed estimates. And so already, like just based off of the rain and the fact that there was flow versus no flow, right? There's some pretty clear consistency. But what happened below ground is, I think, more exciting. I haven't plotted it here, but we found that the rain in both of those really, really dry years was totally sufficient to fully recharge the thin soils at the site. So if you're just measuring the soils and asking like, you know, what's the water storage story? What's the water availability story for the trees? You would have thought that things were fine, but they weren't fine. Despite the wetting in the soils, we found this really consistent deep dry down in the weathered fractured rock. So these little black kind of lines are wells where we actually take these deep water storage measurements. And this is a picture. These are all wells across the hill slope. Each of them, you know, we go through and do these really labor intensive surveys every month to get a water storage estimate. And even though the soil, and I didn't plot it here, even though the soils are basically filling up to their capacity each year, the weather bedrock beneath was not. So in this first year, it did. In the second year, it got a little bit of a blip. All the rest of the rain, right? It only jumped up like less than 50, about 50 millimeters. The rest of that rain was in the soil above. And then in this final year of the drought, almost no water made it down to that depth into the weathered bedrock. And so what were the consequences for the trees? In 2020, we got that partial refilling. The drought tolerant oaks kind of got by, leaf out occurred, sap flows were somewhat depressed. The second year of deep drying was a real situation. It was, I mean, I guess just in the interest of time, I'll wrap up and say we actually had somewhat significant mortality across the site, like 90% of the manzanita died. And manzanita die in weird ways that I didn't understand. I was going to ask you about it. And then probably 1 out of every 3 oaks was killed, 1 out of every 3 or 1 out of every 4. These like 100 plus. We know they're at least 100 years old. We have pictures in the 30s. And then all the trees experienced pretty significant like canopy dieback, partial dieback. Their leaves were like really micro. So this, to me, this is kind of shocking. Like these are really, really old trees, and they're experiencing, you know, a significant fraction of them are dying. And I'll just say to kind of wrap up the story a little bit. January 2023 is the first time since 2019 when the deficit was actually replenished. So you can see that here in a number of plots. So here's the bedrock storage. It reached a capacity in 2019, right? It dropped down, kind of got a little bump there. We finally filled up here. The remote sense storage deficit metric continued to accumulate. It did not get fully replenished. Only soil was replenished. Finally, in 2019, we sort of filled things back up. And there's some cool water potential kind of results that we could talk about, especially disparities between the manzanita and the oak response, which to me are interesting, especially in light of the significant dieback in the manzanita. But yeah, this is kind of a story that we're finally just finishing up. And another thing that I wanted to say about it is that finally in 2023, we got stream flow again. And the really cool part for me was we predicted the week that the streams would start flowing. We like told the landowner had not seen stream flow for like over 3 years. And we said next week in this storm, somewhere at this near the start or towards the end of the week, because there's a sequence of storms, like we could see that the sponge was about to reach capacity via these direct measurements. And so we said like the streams are going to start flowing at the time, and they did. It was awesome. And we could see that. So here's one of the wells at the ridge. So this is the depth of groundwater, 8 meters down. There's groundwater. We had some groundwater response in 2019. The water dropped below the maximum well depth. Nothing ever happened. And then in January, things came back. And this is a zoomed in version of that. So you can see, right, things started to fill up, and then we reached a capacity and then recharge activity. We're going again, and that's when the streams came back to life. And I'll leave this again, like this presentation, I'll provide a link for it here at the end so you can take a look at this. But this is like kind of a big conceptual wrap up of all these things we talked about, and it's a paper we're working on right now. So hopefully we'll be finished with that soon. I can share, and I'll actually put it in the folder here too, if you want me to. So big take homes. You know, we've done a lot of this kind of site-based work. We've found that deficits and calculating them using these cool remote sensing tools are nice organizing frameworks for understanding both tree and stream response to drought. If we want to understand ecohydrology in California, more generally in seasonally dry places, upland forests, we need to study what's happening in soil and the underlying bedrock, importantly. And then this is for like all my Forest Service folks who like to focus on what's happening above ground. Half of our forest is underground, so we need to dig to peer inside of hill slopes and really understand water balance and forest function. So there's a drive folder, and there's this presentation is in that folder, and there's a bunch of papers in there too. So you can scan that with your phone and look at it. And then whenever that paper comes out, I can add it to the folder too. Yeah. Now I can take questions. There's time.
I'm curious, and I'm sure that guys have thought about this a lot, but in the very simple algebraic models that you're talking about,
Yeah.
and in general in this framework, I'm wondering if there's any like I think you said at one point, like evapotranspiration is the only way that water is leaving
Yeah.
the soils and the bedrock. Are there any like more exposed areas where you have like direct soil evaporation? And
Yeah, I mean, especially like the south slopes in this site, like
Yeah.
surface evaporation is like very important.
Yeah,
The remote sensing products that we use for calculating the deficits do also
okay,
account for surface evaporation, so that's in there. And in a sense, like, you're bringing up an important thing, which is like, we don't really resolve what's happening with depth. All we're doing is a mass balance. We're not saying like how deep you have to go or where exactly the water is being removed from, just that it's leaving, so it came from the subsurface. If we were to go and like really resolve where water is being removed, like I think like being able to differentiate surface evaporation from transpiration would be really important. I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah,
I think that like getting at that difference would be important for resolving spatially kind of what's happening below. And to me, that's like a big missing part. We're really treating the whole root zone as one sponge, and we're doing mass balance on that one thing. But really, the root zone is this 10-meter thick thing, and there's some water here. I mean, I even hinted at it, like in this picture, where, you know, there's one thing happening in the bedrock, and there's a whole different thing happening in the soil above it in terms of how much water is there. And so that's a spatially explicit story. Like bedrock's not affected by surface evaporation, but the soil, like significant water is leaving via surface evaporation there. So yeah, it's a good question.
I have a question about kind of invasive species and whether
Yeah.
that they influence kind of the water availability,
Yeah.
or is that not big enough to really influence within the bedrock?
No, that's a cool question. I mean, there's a huge question. It's not really invasives, but like in the coast range right now, there's this like Dougfurification where fire suppression has resulted in like an increased prevalence of like the native conifers. And there's a lot of folks who think that like because of that, there's been big changes in water balance. Conifers using more water during the late dry season, potentially using more water than like a native oak or something would, or a madrone or something like that. So there's a lot of questions around species composition. And then we have questions related to like I mean, there's basically no more perennial like native bunch grass like kind of savannas in California, but it used to be, you know, like all native perennial bunch grass. Whereas all of the, you know, this site is all these grasses that you see are like invasive, like annual European grasses. And these are much more shallow rooted than the perennial bunch grasses that were historically found at this particular place and really everywhere in California. And so like in terms of a water use story, there's again, like a big, I think, spatial depth question there. It's like these perennial bunch grasses probably were much more rooted and had a much more, much like different water use kind of strategy over the summer. And I think that it would be really cool to see like what the difference is between those, but we haven't really done anything with that. The big question we get asked a lot about is like, where are Dougfir getting their water? And do we need to burn them down or cut them all out so that we can improve base flows? That's the big question, I'd say. Yeah.
This might be a stupid question, but given that everyone, like you said, a lot, like people thought it was pretty uncommon for them to be accessing this kind of weathered bedrock.
Yeah,
What percentage of like the root structure and biomass is actually in this weather?
that's a really good question, and we don't know. There's a paper that just came out recently I haven't read yet, by some Chinese researchers who do some of this deep work in, I can't remember the site, where really we think it's probably actually pretty small in terms of like biomass density per length, per depth, per unit depth. There's something it's not much, but the distinction, I guess, is that the plants potentially have, you know, the biomass is sparse, but it's concentrated in great amounts, potentially in fissures and fractures. And then also it's spread out over a very deep profile. So this, you know, the soil might be 50 centimeters thick at this site, but then the weathered bedrock goes from 50 centimeters to 6 meters. And so, you know, it may be like 10 times more depth. So the density of like root material is much lower, but it's spread out over a much greater length. And so in terms of the total volumes of water that these plants are accessing from that layer, it ends up being kind of comparable, even though it's spread out over a greater distance.
Okay, thank you.
That's a really good question, and we don't really know, to be honest, because it's, I don't know what you do. Like I've thought about, there's some cool, this is getting like pretty out there, but I really want to see, I want to learn more about like some geophysical methods, like shocking trees, basically, and like measuring radiation patterns coming from below ground to see where the roots are and how deep they go. And I don't know, I got some weird electrical engineering ideas. People use trees as antennas, like they're conductive things. And so you can use, they radiate if you pulse them with like a radio frequency type, electrical signal or something. So I'm like, I think it's a really cool question, and I don't know the answer. All we can tell you is that like how much water they use. Because there's no other, that water's not going anywhere else. Like we know it's not going down because we're measuring everything. So yeah, but it's a good question.
Thank you.
Does like the subsurface sponge experience publicity after a long period of drying or?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, a lot of soils are, when they are quite desiccated, can be very hydrophobic. The thing is, like the rainfall intensities in California, they're just never so much that, like, it's not like watering a plant in a pot, with where you water it and then the water just kind of shoots through because it's really, really dry and you haven't watered it in 2 weeks or something like that. The rainfall intensities are low enough that usually there's like a pretty crisp, clear, like downward wetting front. There's not a lot of like preferential, if that's what you're referring to.
Yeah.
No, but that's a really good question. I'd say the hydrophobicity piece is more, is pretty applicable in like a lot of burned watersheds where you get such like, not only like hydrophobic soils from like volatilization and condensation of like fats in the plants that makes all these surfaces waxy, but you get clogging of the larger pores with like fine soot particles and stuff. And so there's both like mechanical blocking of flow paths and a hydrophobic effect that really does affect infiltration, but we've never really seen much of like a, what's the word for it? Like a hydrophobic, like hydrophobicity impacting transport at the scale of like a profile. It doesn't really come out like that because things just kind of, it rains and the water like very beautifully infiltrates.
Thank you so much.
Oh.
Everyone, maybe if
Maybe-
you have questions,
Yeah.
we'll let everyone go. Since it's past
Okay.
5. But thank you so much.
Thanks so much.